So today we are continuing through the book of Romans. Now we've got a little bit shorter chapter. I was happy about that because sometimes the longer chapters are a little challenging to condense down. But at Romans chapter 13, and this is an interesting chapter because the first part of Romans chapter 13 kind of seems out of place. It's like, why is that there? You may be familiar with Romans chapter 13. It deals with government and the relationship with government. And Paul hasn't really been talking about that. And then all of a sudden, there's 8 verses that he's kind of discussing that. And then he just kind of continues on. And it's, you have to really kind of zoom out and look at what is Paul doing? How is he going about telling us he's moving now from where he talked about where we find new life in Christ, that we've been forgiven. Now he started in chapter 12 that we looked at last week of really how we start practically doing that. That we start living our lives for him. Here's what that starts to look like. And towards the end of chapter 12, if you remember, he spends a lot of time about do not repay anyone evil for evil. Right? And then he says, but seek to do what is right, seek to do what is good. And so he's hitting on a big problem in society, especially in that day, but it's one that all of us struggle with. Right? When evil is done, no matter who it's to or what, there is a natural human desire to hold that to account, right? To say, no, that is evil. There is a natural desire to see justice done, right? And especially if it's an evil that is done to you, right? You certainly want to see the people who did that or the institution or whatever it may be that brought the evil, you want them to be held to account. And it devolves very easily into repaying evil with evil, right? If there are not some checks to this. And so Paul is looking at this, and this was a very normal thing, especially in that time period. And if you look throughout history, one of the things that causes some of the most devastation are just kind of the constant, oh, well, you did this to my group. Well, now I'm going to do this to your group. And then, oh, well, you elevated that a little bit. So now it's time for my group to do something to your group, right? We've seen that. Doesn't matter what continent, doesn't matter. People are broken down into tribes, into groups, into city-states, into countries, whatever it may be, right? And when evil is then done, the natural human tendency is, okay, well, I'm going to make that right. And we see that, your American history, there was a movie, a few years, the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? And we think, well, the people that live up in the Appalachian Mountains, they're kind of weird anyway. So, but no, that's human nature, right? So the Hatfields do something and then the McCoys respond, and then the Hatfields do something and the McCoys respond. Right? And you all of us can fall into those traps. I've mentioned it before. I like movies like The Godfather. I like mob type movies because it's a fascinating culture, right? Because there is a set of principles that they have, right? Of right and wrong that they define as right and wrong. And if you cross that line and you take out someone from one family and you weren't supposed to, or it wasn't justified, it's not the fact that you take someone out, it's the fact that it wasn't done in the right way with the right people knowing, right? That's the problem. Well, then you cross the line, so now what do we have to do? We're going to take care of it ourselves. Well, what does that turn into? Very literally, a war between different families. And look at the devastation that comes from that. You look at World War I. Why did World War I happen? Basically because you had a lot of different monarchs all basically from the same general family that were heads of all these different countries. And it was still in really still in the mentality of what Paul is dealing with, right? World War I was, because war was seen as, oh, well, that's just something you do. And if someone wrongs you, if you need something, you just go and you take it, right? And so there was a powder keg waiting, and then there was one person that was executed, assassinated. And it started, it started the worst world war that extended into World War II that also has impacted us to this very day, right? And so you see, that's what Paul is kind of talking about when he's thinking about you do not repay evil with evil, because look at what it does, right? And so he's talking both on an individual scale, but then we all know that we live within systems as well. So he finishes in chapter 12, and mind you, Paul is not writing out chapter 12 and then, okay, now the start of chapter 13, right? So it makes more sense if you kind of look at it from that place. So he's just been talking about do not repay evil, anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone, right? And then he gets to chapter 13. He says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority that which God has established, except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authority are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. All right. So let's look at this for just a little bit, and then we're going to move quickly to the last part, which I think is the most important part of Romans chapter 13. But it was important for Paul, I think, to put this in there. And, we've seen this before where Paul is kind of riding on a theme, and then it's nearly like an argument comes to his head, like that he's like, I know there are people that are disagreeing with this and saying, well, but what about this? What about that? And so then all of a sudden he just kind of inserts stuff, right? I kind of get the feeling that that's happening here because the Roman government was not a good government. Now, at this point, it's important to know Nero was probably emperor. And we know Nero, if you know your Roman history, he was crazy, right? He went insane. He burned Rome. He blamed Christians. He became very, very anti-Christian. But at the first, he was not. In fact, Rome was not anti-Christian because they could care less. They had all kinds of different religions. And, okay, just practice what you want, right? And so they were inherently, they didn't just push against one religion or another. But what happened as Christianity became larger and more influential, it became a threat to Caesar because Caesar thought of himself as God, and this religion clearly said otherwise, right? But at this point in history, the faith, Christianity, is relatively new. So one of the reasons that Paul is doing this is he's like, let's not cause trouble where we don't have to cause trouble, right? We are in this governmental system and we have to kind of listen to it. And guess what? God uses governmental systems. And there is a need for government. And I think the first part of this is very important of what it's kind of trying to tell us, because governments do a lot of evil. And one of the things that we start to do is we're like, okay, maybe we just don't need government. Well, the problem is we don't follow the instructions in Romans chapter 12 of not repaying evil with evil, right? So there's going to have to be some societal structures to put the brakes on that, right? And there's nothing perfect because we are sinful. And the more sinful that you are as a people, the worse a government is going to be, right? And I think it's important not to read too much into this passage. Some people have really focused a lot on it and says, well, this means that you just do whatever the government tells you to do. Okay? And you can read that. If you just read that out of context and without reading the rest of Scripture as well, or knowing Paul as well, it kind of sounds like, well, whatever they tell me to do, I have to do, right? Well, Paul didn't do that. Guess where Paul ended up a lot? In prison. Why did he end up in prison? Because he was doing what the government told him to do? No, because he was directly speaking out against the government. And he was directly calling them to account. Okay? So this is not saying blindly follow what government authorities tell you to do. This has been used and manipulated in ugly ways. And whenever they're dealing with apartheid in South Africa, right? There were those who would say, maybe that's not something we need to get into because, all governments are from God and we're supposed to just submit to all governments. No. That same argument could have easily been used of Martin Luther King and his movement. But was that a godly movement? Yes, I believe that it certainly was. It was calling the government to account. And they were doing things that went against the government. Right? I believe that was inspired by God to bring about what was right. But what this passage is, so it's not telling us just do whatever the government wants you to do. But it is also pushes back on those people who say, you know what, we just don't need any government. We'll just do this all of ourselves. Because that doesn't work either. Neither works. And I love this first passage. It says, says, let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Now, what is that saying? That everything is below God. Who is the most important in this picture, in this relationship? It is God. It is your relationship with God. That is number one. That is most important. That is who you follow no matter what. Ideally, you would want to live at peace with your government, right? Which means you try to submit to their authority if possible. But when their authority is not godly, then you have to start evaluating, how am I going to handle this? Right? And that's going to be different in all kinds of different spaces and in different times. Back in Rome, there was nothing that the Christians were going to be able to do at that time to change the government structure. Right? They weren't going to be able to campaign and try to vote out Nero in the next election. Right? This was a completely different context. And so Paul is saying, be careful what you're doing. Let's focus on living the way that God wants us to live. And that's how we're going to start changing things. And guess what? They did. Right? Things did start to change. But this is a complicated dynamic. And it certainly doesn't mean that we don't stand up for what is right and that we don't push back against government when it is wrong. And what does it says? That governments are established by God to do what? For the good of society, right? So government should be able to step in and prevent that pattern of repaying evil with evil, right? That is what a government should do, so that it's someone else that is exacting justice, so it's not vengeance. right? And that hopefully keeps society from spinning out of control. Now, unfortunately, the more secular and sinful governments become, the worse it gets. Right? We see that, right? Right now, we're dealing with that again this weekend. Right? There was a brutal use of force, over the top, inexcusable, and people see that, and your first instinct and response should be, we need justice for that. That cannot happen, right? And our system is not perfect by any means. I will say, at least those who did that, even though that they were representatives of the government, are now being held accountable. They are at least going to be charged, and that justice is going to hopefully come, right? But we see how sensitive this subject is, right? Because all of us see that and we start questioning, okay, wait, why? And here are the arguments immediately start coming out. Well, you know what? Why? We've given way too much power to police. And in some ways we have. And so then it's like, well, do we even need the police? Look at the bad that they are doing. Yeah, especially in this case. It's horrible, right? It's not good at all. It needs to be held to account. Hopefully, our system will hold them to account, right? But then this is the perfect opportunity for people who like to sow chaos to come in and just to blow things like this up, right? And that's why Paul is talking about this relationship with the government, because it causes more societal chaos than anything else. And we have to be very careful about that. And it is so frustrating that we live in a society right now that every incident is being manipulated to make everyone angry and cause everyone to not trust the system at all, right? And there's things in the system that need to be changed and adjusted, but you can't just throw out the systems. Right? But this is a result whenever as a society, we become further and further moving away from being rooted in God. And we start to think that we can be God, right? When the government starts to think that they are God, that is worst case scenario. And that's kind of what we're seeing. And then we have people that are complicit in this, little off topic, but people that are complicit, you look at media and things like that the way that things like this are covered just cause more of the chaos. It's like, well, why don't we cover all of these incidents? Maybe then we would see there's different patterns than what we're being told there are, right? But we pick and choose which things we're going to inflame and try to get people upset about, and which ones we don't, right? And again, there's no perfect system because we live in a fallen world. And that's kind of what Paul is talking about here, right? It'd be great if there was no government, and we wouldn't need a government if no one repaid evil with evil, right? And if no one committed evil, you wouldn't need any of this. But that's not the world we live in. So now we have to include that. And then we have to hold that government to account. And one thing that I'll say is, before we move on with Romans chapter 13, I completely disagree with the notion that means that as Christians, we shouldn't be involved with our government. Especially our government and our system of government. It was created for us to have a voice in it. And you can argue how much voice we actually have, but it was created with that in mind. And in fact, the founders and the things that they are talking about, that this system is created, and the only way that it works truly effectively is for a good and moral people to be involved, right? And it is really sad how many within the church have used Romans 13 as an excuse. Oh, you know what? That's political stuff. We don't talk about that. Well, I think here's the result, is what we're dealing with now, right? And so this is something that we have a right and a responsibility. And I believe that God has called us to speak into the government to get it to do what God desires for the governments to do, which is to benefit society and be good for people. Right? We need to be pushing the government to do that. Right? And so Paul he's recognizing you're in a difficult time. Yes, you're living under Roman rule, and there's a lot of ungodly things that are going on. But for all that you can do, try to live at peace with the government until you can't. And there were times that Paul couldn't, right? And things would change. And Nero would go off his rocker, and he would start throwing Christians to lions, and then it becomes very, very challenging, right, to not repay evil with evil. But that's why we have to understand what Paul is talking about and how important it is that we focus on the way that we live our lives, the relationship that we have with Christ, and that we live the life he's calling us to. And that needs to hopefully impact the world around us. And by the way, with Rome, it eventually did. Right? So Nero goes crazy, starts persecuting Christians because the Christians started growing and having more influence in society. And they stood up for values and for morals. And it was offensive to people. They didn't want to be a mirror to be held up where they could see their sinfulness. Right? And then you had people like Nero say, wait, what do you mean? There's actually a God who is above me? Right? And so it causes chaos. And that's why we have to make sure we are rooted in the one who is our anchor, the one who gives us wisdom to navigate these complicated relationships, because we live in this world that is filled with injustice. And when governments start to be responsible for that injustice, it gets very difficult very quickly. And the church needs to be making sure that we are speaking out and holding accountable our government officials in any ways that we can. And so Paul continues. So he kind of throws that out there, saying, hey, I know you're gonna find lots of reasons to just say, I don't want to have anything to do with this government system because it is evil. And so he says, but wait, it's got to be there. Let's learn how to live with it. We'll work through this. And then he gets into how you should be living within that structure. And he says, let no debt, this is verse 8, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfillment of the law. Right? Now, what Paul just goes through there is the answer to all of the garbage that we encounter, right? Is if we treated people as neighbors and we loved each other, right? And just treated people with a level of respect, most of the issues would fall away, and you wouldn't have to worry about a government getting too involved, right? Because everyone is living according to that law. This is what makes me so angry whenever people try to view Scripture or view the Bible or view religion as, oh, it's just those ridiculous rules. And they just want you to follow all these rules. And why would they want you to do that? And then you're like, so tell me the downside of people not murdering each other. Yeah, that's a rule. It is. And it's a pretty dogmatic rule, right? The Bible says you shall not murder. And it's like, well, is there a downside to that? Maybe that's a good one to follow. And then committing adultery. How much good has come from adultery? Yeah, not a whole lot, right? Amazingly, God can work through things, and there can be good on the distant side of it, right? Because God doesn't give up on us. But look at the cost, right? So is that a ridiculous rule that God says, you know what? Why don't you find one person and why don't you sleep with them and have a family with them and not go to other people? Oh, that's so restrictive. Don't you know this is the year 2023? And it's like, yeah, because maybe God knew what was best for us and for society. God didn't put the rules just because he loved being a rule maker. He did it because he's like, this is what's best for you. Morons, right? That was added by me. It's not scriptural. But you know he has to think that sometimes, right? It's like, what are you doing? How stupid do you have to be to get mad at me for showing you how to live the best life in the midst of this world, right? I mean, that is a wonderful trick by Satan to get us to believe that. And it says, do not steal, do not covet. Why not pay attention to what God has given you and what he's entrusted with you rather than constantly looking at others and coveting others? This is a big one that we're seeing, and it impacts all of us. Coveting is one of those because it's a word that we don't use anymore, right? So we kind of, whatever, I don't even know what that means, right? Well, it's basically the basis of what's causing all of the mental and anxiety that we're experiencing in our country and society right now. What is social media based on? Getting you to covet, right? That is what it is for. It is there strictly to make sure you're breaking the 10th commandment every day. Now, I'm not saying don't get on social media, even though that wouldn't be a horrible thing. But you have to recognize what it's doing. And it is not helping you. Is our society in better shape now? No, it's not. You can just look at all the measurables. And it is attacking our youth in unbelievable ways. And I know as a kid, whenever adults would tell me this is not healthy for you, I'd just, well, you're just an old person, right? And I get that. And so I know our youth are hearing that and saying, oh, you don't understand what it's like to be a kid now. You're right, and I'm glad I'm not a kid now because you are being lied to in more ways than any other generation has been lied to, right? And the coveting, what happens on social media so often is you put your best self out there or you put your worst self out there to get sympathy, right? But mostly it's putting your best self out there, and then people look at that, well, why isn't my family like that? Or why don't I look like that whenever I take those pictures? Or whatever it may be, right? And what it does is it just starts working your mind, and all of a sudden you're not satisfied with anything. Everything, you feel like you need more, right? And then you're not even caring about people. You're just looking at stuff and things and status, right? It's destroying. And that's Paul is saying we have to step back. We have to recognize what's going on. And we have to start loving each other as our neighbor, right? So that we don't look at someone, we don't follow someone on social media just to see all the stuff. We recognize, wait, that's a person that is broken and flawed and sinful, just like me, right? This is very important, and we're seeing what it's doing to society by just the unbelievable rise in the mental health issues, all that kind of stuff. And we're trying to treat that in ways that's not going to fix the problem. Right? Just because you're on medication and looking at social media doesn't mean it's going to help. Right? If you continue to covet after you're on medication, you're still going to struggle. Right? It is a ugly system that's going on right now. And I think this is what Paul is talking about. He's like, we live in this complicated world that has so many different messages coming. And we need to make sure that we are the only death that we have is that we love each other. And then in verse 11, it says this, it says, and do this, understanding the present time, the hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in the carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, and not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. Now, I love this. It says, you better understand what time it is. The hour has come. You need to understand what's going on in society. You need to understand what's happening. And it says, wake up from your slumber. You know, and I love this illustration. You can either live in a slumber or you live awake. Right? And this, I think, happened last night, that we have about 1,100 dogs in our house right now. Yeah, and one. That's right. I forgot that one. 1,101 dogs in our house. And about 3:15 in the morning, for some reason, 560 of those dogs start making noises of some sort. Right? And so if you've ever kind of been woken up whenever it's not time to wake up, and your goal is you're sitting there in bed and you're like, Lord, please just take me now. Like that's my first thought, right? And then you realize, no, I think you still have a purpose for me on this earth, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to go and let a dog out. And you're like, I don't know if that's what you desire of me, Lord, but I know I'm going to have to do it. But Lord, how can I do this without waking up? I want to stay in my slumber, right? So you try it mentally. It's like, okay, I'm going to just kind of slide out of bed. I don't want to put too much effort into it. I know I have to be able to see a little bit, but I don't want to see fully. So like, because I know if I open my eyes all the way, I'm done. Right? I want to stay in the slumber. And so you kind of go and you like find handles and stuff like that. And then of course you stump your toe on something. You know, it never works out the way you want to. But you would like to stay in that slumber. Right? And then you crawl back into bed. And you just pray, Lord, just knock me out. Whatever it takes. If it's a literal knock on the head, it's fine. Right? And it's a weird place, and we've all been there. And where you start to have to function, and you can function, but you're just in this kind of fog. And you're just kind of, I just want to stay there. I just want to stay in the fog. I don't want to be aware of anything other than what I'm doing right at this moment, right? And what Paul is saying, you better start living awake, not in the slumber, right? Now, it's good for me to try to stay in the slumber at 3:30 in the morning when I'm dealing with dogs. But when it comes to how you're going to engage in the world around you as a Christian, you better be fully awake and not going around in a slumber. And what we're doing in our society is we're trying to keep everyone in a slumber. We're trying to keep things confusing. We're trying to keep things pretty blurry, not knowing what is true, what is not true. We're telling kids you can be a boy or you can be a girl, you can do this, you can do that. Let's just cause as much confusion as possible, because whenever you're dealing with all that confusion, it's like that stupid dog waking you up at 3:30 in the morning. You're pretty angry about it. And you're like, I don't really want to fully deal with this because it's too much. Let me just stay in the slumber. That's where I'm comfortable. That's where I want to be. And Paul is saying, no, as a Christian, you better wake up. Better wake up and start putting on the armor of light. Like, we have a responsibility to wake people up who are in the slumber and tell them there's a better way. You don't have to live with all this confusion, because you can live a life that God has called you to live. God has the answers to that. God has the rules that will actually make your life better than make the life confusing. And I encourage all of us to make sure that we wake up, that we don't just get content to be in the slumber. Sometimes that's what we want to do. It's like, no, you know what? I don't want to deal with and talk about how to engage in the government. I don't want to talk about, sexuality issues or what's right or what's wrong. I just want to go through my day. I get that, because there's no easy answers. But God's called us to be awake, because when we start being awake, what happens is we start living a life that He wants us to live. And then that reflects to those who are still in the slumber, and they start saying, maybe that's a life I want to live. Maybe it's time for me to live differently. And you know what? That's what happened in Rome. Is these Christians started living different lives, and they started being attractive to other people and other groups, and people who had practiced pagan religions all of a sudden start seeing, wow, there's a different way to live? And the answer was yes. But the only way that people will know there's a different way to live is for us to start living it. We need to live awake, put on the armor of light, right, that brings the light of God into the dark world around us, so that those who are in the slumber can wake up to the life-changing power of Jesus Christ. Let's go to Him in prayer.